Okay, so the next section for chapter 10, looking at delayed density dependence. Delays in density effects on population size, which is the number of individuals born in one period can be influenced by the population densities and other conditions that were present several time periods ago. For example, predators that reproduce more slowly than prey, there's a time lag if the prey population increases, meaning that the delayed response here is that the prey can reproduce pretty quickly, and it takes another few generations for the predators to reproduce following that similar trend. So typically prey items reproduce more quickly, they're shorter lived, they are more fecund, where predators might have a 6-month gestation period and only have 1 or 2 young, where prey might have a 3-month gestation period and have like 8 or 10 young. So the lynx hare example, think about that here, where hare or rabbits can have multiple broods a year and have many individuals in each one of those events, where a large cat or predatory cat might only have 1 or 2 cubs a year and care for them for a year or 2. So we're going to walk through this blowfly experiment and go back and read it again. It takes a little bit to think through it. We'll walk through this first graph here first, and the upper graph rather. This is the number of adult flies in thousands in this population. The little spiky lines here are the number of adult flies produced from eggs laid on the date given. So what's missing from this graph, which would be great if it was here, is the number of eggs that didn't reach maturity. So here we're laying eggs, maggots come out, and no matter how many maggots are there, 10, 100, 1,000, they're all fighting over 50 grams of ground liver. So if you are a maggot and you come out and there's only 2 other maggots there, all 3 of you are sharing these 50 grams of ground liver. You can grow fat and happy. You can metamorphose into an adult fly and go on to lay more eggs. In this first experiment, there's unlimited food for adults. So if you can make it to adulthood, the buffet is open, smorgasbord as much as you want, but you have to get through this maggot stage where there's only 50 grams of ground liver for everybody that's there. So if you emerge from the egg as a maggot and there's 1,000 other maggots there all fighting over 50 grams, the chances are you're all going to die. And so that's the you're all going to die sections are these blank sections where none of the eggs hatched into maggots that then successfully transformed into adult flies. So we can kind of start here. So we've got a starting population, some eggs. They've got 50 grams of ground liver. A number of them are able to hatch. We have this adult fly population, gets unlimited food. What are these adult flies doing? They're just laying eggs like crazy, right? So in here, there's a whole bunch of eggs that are laid that aren't displayed. And then the adult population starts to die off. These things only live for a few days. So all your adult flies start dying off. There's a few adult flies hanging on that likely hatched right here. They're hanging on. They lay a couple eggs, but there's much less competition. There's fewer eggs that are laid. Those are able to survive and hatch, and then you get a peak from those. And the similar thing happening again here. A couple survive here. All of these eggs that they're laying all through here are all dying. The population comes down. There's not that many eggs are laid. And because there's not that many eggs are laid, their food is not limiting. There's enough food for some of the maggots to metamorphose into adult flies. You see that peak. Overall, a smaller peak, which is kind of interesting. Going down, none of these eggs are surviving. None of these eggs are surviving. Population is dwindling. They lay a bunch of eggs. A bunch of those survive, which leads to a huge peak. which leads to a big section of, again, there's eggs being laid the whole time here, but there's just so many eggs being laid that those maggots are all fighting for 50 grams of ground liver. Not the prettiest example in the world. I apologize. They're all fighting for 50 grams of liver. There's not enough energy for any of them to metamorphose into adults, and so they all die. Until the population starts to shrink again down here, where now eggs laid, there's less competition. All of those eggs, or all those larvae, maggots metamorphose into flies. Boom, same thing over and over again. Again, once you make it to a fly, buffet's open, you get as much food as you want. You can keep on going. Here, they did the same experiment again. 50 grams for maggots, unlimited for adults. And then here they started to limit the adults as well, which served to stabilize the population a bit more. So we still have some peaks and valleys, but it's generally more stable. Meaning that now there's some selection at the adult stage as well. So both, make sure I'm... this delay dependence, negative effects of we're not filtering later. Okay, yeah. So when the adults have a limited food as well, you've got a little bit more selection pressure there, and so that population's more stable. They're going to not be able to lay as many eggs, and so that's keeping the egg density down. Where when the adults have unlimited food, they're going to put out tons of eggs, which is then going to make the ground liver limiting. I believe in the second experiment they're both given limited food. So that, because when you one side's, you can think of like one side's kind of out of whack. Like adults have as much food as they want, so they're laying as many eggs as possible. And now those eggs, the food for the maggots becomes limiting. If they're both limited, then you can have a fair number of adults, but they're only producing a moderate number of eggs. So you have more adults, but they're less fecund for each one. And that can help to stabilize the population. Oh, going the wrong way here. Fluctuations in population size can risk extinction. Using computer simulations looking at 3 random populations where they were allowed to fluctuate, 2 populations recovered from low numbers, 1 became extinct. I like this graph. We like this graph. So looking at this graph, you have 3 populations. They all start at 10 individuals, and they have a randomized variation in their growth from year to year. The blue, I'm going to call that red, or it could be green or gray, or I don't know. Green? Let's call it green. Blue, green, and black. They're all kind of hopping along about the same. They all start off at 10. Blue's looking kind of down here. It's not doing so good. Black shoots up like GME, like GameStop stock. And then like GameStop stock comes crashing down, kind of peters along, and then ultimately goes to extinction. The other 2 populations are able to increase, and one of them kind of wildly increases. And this is just due to, again, small starting populations and growth rate varying randomly from year to year. And so if you happen to get 3 or 4 or 5 random bad growth years in a row, you can move to extinction. If you get a number of really good growth years in a row, then you can shoot way up like this. So think of this as GameStop. Think of these as 2 other stocks. Apologies for the GME folks. The degree of fluctuation is also important. If variation of population growth rate is high, the chances of population extinction will rise. If variation in growth rate, if population growth rate is high, extinction rate's also high. So you can think about organisms that are really sensitive to environmental variation, that have a kind of a boom and bust life cycle or life history. And if those populations are small, they sort of disproportionately feel whatever those environmental variations are, which can drive them to zero or can drive them to millions. When variable environmental conditions result in large fluctuations in growth rate, there's a high risk of extinctions. And so again, tightly tied to environmental variation, small populations are at risk. This is an example of Southern California, these are the Channel Islands. And this is looking at bird populations. This is work by Jones and Diamond. I forget Jones's first name. Diamond, it's Jared Diamond, like the guy who wrote Guns, Germs, and Steel, among other books. I'm trying to see, I don't know where my books are from him. He's actually a bird guy. He's done a bunch of other stuff too, but so they looked at based on historic records, and so both like early museum collections, explorer notes. I don't think they used archaeological data, which is kind of what we do now, but tried to build a history of bird populations throughout the Channel Islands, and were able to estimate that about 40% of the populations with less than 10 breeding pairs went extinct. So the probability of extinction and the number of breeding pairs was tightly linked, where individuals with small, initial breeding pairs were much more likely to go to extinct than populations with many more breeding pairs. It's like one of those things that, it makes sense. Like, if your population is 20 and this other population is 20,000, which one's more likely to go extinct? Generally, the smaller number. But it's tied into their relative feel of environmental variability and sensitivity to that. Effective population size is the number of individuals that contribute offspring to the next generation. Effective population size. So when we do, you can imagine doing a census and counting up all of the people in Whatcom County, that number does not equal the effective population size. The effective population size is the number of individuals that can contribute offspring to the next generation. So the number of reproductively of age individuals. So the same thing is true in, you could think about doing a fish survey, again looking at largemouth bass I'm going to talk about smallmouth bass in Lake Whatcom. All of the little tiny fry that are not old enough to reproduce, you wouldn't count. There's not, with the exception of large mammals, I don't know of that many examples of senescence, meaning you're alive after your reproductive potential. There's examples in elephants and orcas, things like that, but generally not in like the fish world, in other organisms. So generally effective population size would be not counting the pre-reproductive individuals. In the cases where there's an age at which reproduction no longer occurs, you would include those individuals. Reduction of the effective population size can result in extinction vortex. Small population size leads to further declines in population size, eventually resulting in extinction. So we can look at that here, and this is all exacerbated by small population size. So at small population sizes, we can be exposed to inbreeding depression, just the genetic degradation that happens from producing offspring with closely related individuals. Genetic drift, which we talked about in one of the prior chapters, of just that small sample size, this few number of individuals, just based on gene transfer, you can start to fix or lose alleles out of the population. Demographic stochasticity, Demographic stochasticity is the example of just by random chance, you happen not to be produce a lot of offspring effectively. Where environmental stochasticity is the environment changing or being like a number of drought years. If you happen to have 3 drought years in a row, that would be an environmental stochasticity, environmental variability. All of these things lead to loss of genetic diversity, which can reduction in individual fitness in the population to adapt, so impacting future adaptability. This can lead to lower reproduction, which leads to a smaller effective size, and this can also lead to higher mortality, which leads to a smaller effective size and eventually leads to extinction. So all of the small population size impacts are generally bad, particularly when we're looking at small population size as it's done through reduction. So we're not meaning the impact of dispersal, because like in the jellycomb example, that started off as a small population size, but that's a novel species. That's a new species introduced in the ecosystem. We're talking about where there were many, now there are few, and this can be caused by habitat destruction, overharvesting, climate change, invasion, natural factors, floods, hurricanes, tornadoes, things like that. So generally, we're looking at populations that were large that have now gotten smaller. All of these small population size issues can prevent them from rebounding and achieving their prior sizes. So factors that place small populations at risk for extinction: genetic drift and inbreeding depression both reduce genetic diversity, individual fitness, and adaptability of population. Genetic drift, chance events influence which alleles are passed on to the next generation, creating alleles to become lost or become fixed. The frequency becomes 100%. Again, we talked about that more a couple chapters ago. Inbreeding is the mating between related individuals. That can increase the frequency of homozygotes, including those that have 2 copies of a harmful allele. And there's an example of lions in Tasmania that were nearly driven to extinction by this outbreak of biting flies. So it's reducing genetic diversity and increasing the chance of having 2 recessive genes matched that would have a negative impact. Here's this example, the plague of flies, of lions in Tanzania. There's this crater in Tanzania where these lions were nearly driven to extinction by a catastrophic outbreak of biting flies similar to those that on the face of the male. Lions became covered with infected sores, and eventually could not hunt, resulting in many deaths. The population descended from a few survivors. Genetic drift and inbreeding depression have led to subsequent sperm anomalies, such as the 2-headed sperm, as shown here. So in this case, genetic drift and inbreeding reduced the fertility of males. The population size has since increased, but testing shows that all individuals descended from 15 lions, and the population has low genetic variation and high frequency of sperm anomalies. So there's this big selection event. In this case, it was these biting flies killing a bunch of lions. A few lions make it through this outbreak of biting flies. The ones that are left happen to be carriers for these genetic anomalies, in this case, presumably infertile 2-headed sperms. And because they're the few individuals left in the population, now what was a minor, a rare trait in the population is now the major trait in the population because everybody else is dead. So now this this reduced fertility is not 100% within the population, but still higher spread. And the individuals that are in the population all derive from the same 15 survivors. So there's very low genetic diversity. Genetic diversity can be propped up by just a few individuals. It doesn't take a whole lot of migration to help normalize genetic diversity. So bringing a few additional lines in could potentially improve the genetics and help stabilize the population. Demographic stochasticity is the chance events affect survival and reproduction of individuals. An example of in a population of 10 individuals, a storm wipes out 6. The 40% survival rate may be much lower than an average rate of the species. So a random chance event happens to wipe out a bunch of people or individuals in the population. This is broken down here, which is kind of an interesting way of thinking about it, which is in a population of 2 individuals with a 1 in 3 chance of reproduction. The probability that no offspring will be produced is 11%. And this chance of 1 in 3 in successfully reproducing is actually a relatively high number. There's lots of species where few individuals wind up making it to reproduction. And so you can say, well, we've got 2 individuals, there's a good chance that they'll have young. There is, an 89% chance, but there's also 11% chance. And so now if we scale that up to, say, having 20 individuals, what's the probability that all 20 of those might not have offspring? Or the probability that 10 or 15 of them don't have offspring and our population is now decreasing instead of increasing. For a large population size, the risk of extinction from demographic stochasticity is very small because as you scale that up, if you have 10,000 individuals, the probability of 2 of them or a few of them not having offspring is kind of washed out. But if you only have 5 or 10 and due to stochastic chance, 80% of those don't have young, your population is going to decrease. It's not likely, but it's more likely if there's fewer individuals. Is one way of thinking about it. I think in the book they gave an example of like flipping a coin. If you flip a coin 3 times, you might not get a tails, which can happen. There's a 50-50 chance each time you flip the coin that you're going to get a tail versus a head. That might happen 3 times in a row. You might get heads 3 times in a row. Now, if you flip the coin 1,000 times, it's much more probable that you're going to get a tail, right? And your distribution will start to become closer to that 50-50 that's expected. Allele effects. Allele effects are pretty interesting. It's a growth rate, and when we say growth rate, we mean population growth rate decrease. Population growth rate decreases as population density decreases. At low densities, individuals may have difficulty finding mates. Allele effects can reduce small population size even further. Okay, I'm going to give an example here. It's a little show and tell. Now these images up here are white abalone. What I'm going to show are red abalone, but they're effectively, they both have the same issue. So these are both red abalone. Red abalone is the largest abalone species in the world. These are both from Northern California. Abalone are broadcast spawners, which means they shoot sperm and egg up into the water column, and sperm and egg have to meet, get fertilized, float around for a while, and settle back down. Now, these are relatively big critters. Like this it's not a 10-inch abalone, but it's over 9.5, and this one's maybe about 9.5. This one's much deeper. These animals, their effective spawning range is at most 6 feet. So 6 feet would be like me kind of spread all the way across here. I think at 6 feet apart, the likelihood of fertilization is something like 10% of the sperm and egg will be fertilized. Now, if they're close, like a foot apart, it's much, much higher. Now, that's fine when red abalone populations are in high density, and you can go down to a rock and you can see a whole bunch right next to each other. You know, they're going to spawn and be happy. But now, when you start to remove them through fisheries, and you've got one over here, and the other one might be 100 meters away. 100 meters, 300 feet. That's not very far. But at that distance, these two critters at 100 meters apart are not spawning. They're the only two on the reef, and they, releasing all the sperms and eggs they can, like their life's depended on it, they would not successfully reproduce. 0% chance of reproduction at that distance. Now that has become an issue for the white abalone shown here. White abalone are critically endangered. They're only found in California. They were the preferred commercially harvested abalone. These reds are quite large. There's a huge foot in here. This probably had like a 2-3 pound foot. Right now in the black market, they're over $100 a pound. I'm not checked black market prices lately, but over $100 a pound. And the foot is, this is snail effectively, right? The foot is very hard. The foot's what you eat. The muscle that holds it onto the rock is very, very, very hard. Kind of has a scallop type flavor to it, but it's very tough, and so you got to pound the snot out of it if you're going to eat it. White abalone, they're very tender, and so they were the preferred, abalone to eat. And the big abalone harvest, commercial harvest, happened more in the 50s, and people just pound them and then have abalone sandwiches, like a fried fish sandwich. Now it's like, higher class sashimi, that kind of thing. But that market force drove down white abalone populations in addition to poaching. So now there's a few out there, but they are tightly guarded secrets to where they are. And there's been relocation programs to gently move abalone from one spot to another so we can start to have aggregations. And it's they're kind of hedging their bets, because we want to put 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 white abalones on the same reef next to each other. So when they spawn, that spawn will actually be successful compared to what they are now, which is individuals spaced out across hundreds of meters along a reef that are never going to, their sperm and eggs are never going to meet. Now, the flip side of that coin is you put a whole bunch of critters that are worth hundreds of dollars a piece right on top of each other. If a morally flexible individual finds them, they could wipe out the entire population in a few minutes. So there's a big risk around that, but because of alley effects, we have to have these animals next to each other. So I think white abalone, to me, is the poster child of an alley effect. The book gives some other examples. Tunas need to find each other. There's some other kind of examples. None of them are as good as the abalone. Environmental stochasticity is erratic or unpredictable changes in the environment. The Yellowstone grizzly bear population growth rate varies from year to year. Models show the population is at risk of extinction of random environmental variation if females drop below 30 or 40. So this graph plots the risk of Yellowstone grizzly bear population will be close to extinction in 50 years against the population size of females, studying about 40 years of census data. And researchers found that if the average population growth rate of the grizzlies could lead to explosive growth if it remained consistent from year to year, the risk of extinction increased dramatically at random variation in environmental conditions, dropped the population size to 40 or less. Extinction risk gets much lower as you get more. Environmental stochasticity is much larger at smaller sizes. So in this example, environmental stochasticity would be things like reduction in prey, bad winters, not a lot of forage in the spring, anything that environmentally changing the likelihood of survivorship for the, in this case, bears. But you can generally think about I usually think about like shorter-lived animals, things that are tightly linked to the annual growing season, and what that variation looks like. I just want to jump back up to demographic stochasticity, because this is the random event of the randomized, this is a better example here, the random probability of individuals producing offspring and the variation there within it. So demographic stochasticity is a bit more around the demographics, number of offspring produced, things like that, likelihood of successful mating. Environmental stochasticity is changes that are directly related to the environment. And then you have natural catastrophes, floods, fires, etc., can eliminate or greatly reduce even large populations and play a role in extinctions. There's this example of heath hens that were reduced to one population of 50 on Martha's Vineyard, and then a series of bad weather, fires, and diseases, and predators drove out the population. They kind of got hit with everything, and they were all in one spot. So the story of the heath hen is don't keep all your eggs in one basket. And in this case, the basket happened to be Martha's Vineyard. Population had grown back to, was it 20? There were 2,000 individuals, I think, but they were all on that same spot. And so that spot just got hammered by a fire, some bad winters, which you usually get winter kills, and then diseases that introduce predators. And so if that was part of a larger like metapopulation, then it would have been fine, but it was the last, the only like source population. So when that got knocked out, everything else got knocked out. So when the heath hens were doing better, they probably should have moved some of them somewhere else, but they didn't. Okay, that'll wrap up. I think, yeah, that wraps up chapter 10.